Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to today's webinar, World Preview 2023, Pharma's Age of Uncertainty, hosted by Evaluate. Some brief introductions. My name is Daniel Chancellor. I'm going to be playing the role of host and moderator today. Delighted to be joined by two colleagues who are definitely bringing the subject matter expertise. Firstly, we have Paul Verdin, who is the VP at Evaluate and head of our consulting and analytics business. And secondly, we're also joined by Melanie Senior. Mel is a freelance healthcare writer, a long-term collaborator with Evaluate, and indeed the author of this report. So very delighted to have you both with us. Just in my role as moderator, I've got a few things to go over first before we can dive into the content. This session is being recorded, so hopefully that gets ahead of any questions you might have. So feel free to sit back and relax, and we'll share the recording and the slides with you afterwards. In terms of other questions, please get in touch with us as we go through the webinar. So Q&A box, chat box, love to hear from you. We'll try and weave in your questions as we go through our conversation. And if we don't have time, I apologize, but we'll definitely get in touch with you afterwards. So on to what we're going to be talking about today. Firstly, Mel's going to be giving an introduction as to why this is Pharma's Age of Uncertainty. And then we're going to pass over to Paul, who's going to talk you through some of the data snapshots, the highlights from within World Preview 2023. Just notes, we're going to be sharing some of the highlights, but there's a lot more to find. So please do grab a link to the full white paper as well, and we'd love to hear any feedback. Without any further ado, though, I'd like to pass on to Mel. So why is it Pharma's Age of Uncertainty?
Thank you very much, Dan, for the intro. Great to be here. Well, I think I can give you a few reasons why we've used this title for the report. I could actually sum it up in 9 letters: IRA, FTC, FDA, but let's use a few words at least. So here's Big Pharma, the pharma industry generally facing this very significant patent cliff, over $100 billion in potential lost sales because of expiries coming up in the very near term, the next 5 to 10 years. But deciding what to license or buy to fill those gaps, and just the regular gaps that are ongoing as part of the industry mechanics, just became a lot harder because of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. That act makes it much more difficult to project what assets will be worth in the future, because it's going to cap the prices of initially 10 most expensive Medicare drugs starting in 2026, but then ramping up to an additional 10, 15 in subsequent years. Critically, though, the Inflation Reduction Act treats small molecules differently to biologics. As you both know, small molecules get a sort of free pass of just 9 years on the market without becoming eligible in any way for these price curbs, whereas biologics have a longer 13 years. And we're already seeing how that asymmetry is provoking changes in deal-making landscape, changes to negotiations. There's a scramble for biologic assets. They're becoming relatively more expensive as a result. We're hearing from both CEOs and bankers, and perhaps there's relatively less interest in some small molecules as well. So I think that's one of the unintended consequences of the Inflation Reduction Act, because obviously there's incredible scientific advances in chemistry of small molecules, and there are clear advantages in those drugs in terms of patient convenience. So the IRA does a lot more besides cap these 10, 15 drugs. You're probably thinking, well, big deal. Well, actually, it is actually going to curb annual inflation and annual price rises on all drugs that Medicare uses to at or below inflation. And I think it's that provision that may have an even more significant impact on pharma's bottom line than the price negotiations on the 10, 15 drugs. So that's our first, if you like, bucket of uncertainty. Second one, FTC, Federal Trade Commission. That is the body that looks into M&A, into merger deals, and says, is it going to be anti-competitive? Is it going to be, disadvantageous to consumers or not? And that body is throwing its net a lot wider. I think we've seen plenty of evidence for that. It's not just looking at sort of plain vanilla product area overlaps or therapy area dominance that particular companies might gain through a deal, but it's also looking into sort of potential future harms, like how a company may behave in the future around pricing, for instance. We saw this most prominently, I think, with the Amgen Horizon merger. This is a not insignificant $84 billion deal that has now recently been settled out of court, but nevertheless, the FTC is, its ability to reach in and demand more documentation and delay deals and ask for reviews has gotten a lot sharper. And certainly lawyers I've spoken to are saying, things are harder and more complicated and more expensive. So regardless of the particular legal outcome in that case. So that's our second bucket of uncertainty. The third one, FDA, the Food Drug Administration, obviously a necessary part of the pharma industry, the US regulator. However, they have been clamping down on accelerated approvals, which is one of the important regulatory pathways, particularly used for oncology drugs. There are more stronger demands for confirmatory trials, etc. New guidance coming out. So there's some shifts there as well, some apparent teeth sharpening, should we call it. And so the point about these three buckets of uncertainty that I've just sort of sketched isn't necessarily that they're definite, strong headwinds facing the industry. It's that they're uncertainties. We don't know. The IRA might actually go away. Very unlikely, but it could get delayed. There are lots of lawsuits, which we'll talk about later. FTC maybe has been defanged because of the settlement with Amgen Horizon. A lot of people saying wouldn't have won in court anyway, so maybe that's now a non-threat. And then FDA is FDA, and it is not a new thing, obviously, and that can shift with politics in the US to some degree as well. So the point is not that they're necessary headwinds, but they are uncertainties, and business hates uncertainty, as we all know. So that's the context here. Now, I am going to hand over here to Paul to bring a bit of optimism into the webinar. Because despite all this, I think the pharma sector growth is projected to remain pretty strong for the rest of the decade.
Thank you, Mel. Absolutely. Thank you for that. So as Dan said, I'm going to talk through a few visuals here, which are really just a snapshot of data from the World Peer Review report this year. So let me start with this one, and maybe just a quick word on methodology before we begin. For those of you that might not be so familiar, this data is all coming from Evaluate Pharma. So wherever we have a historical time point, this is company reported data. Wherever we have a future time point, this is a consensus of sell-side research. Okay, so with that, this chart here is showing that optimism, I think, Mel. So this is the top line industry picture in terms of revenue forecasts out to 2028. That's the horizon that we have in Evaluate Pharma today. And what I hope you can see first up is that really there's a really strong growth trajectory out to 2028. The industry moves from, I think you hopefully can see on the slide, just around about 1.1 trillion market today, up to closer to 1.6 trillion in 2028. That's an almost 6%, 5.9% compound annual growth rate from today out to 2028, which is very much comparable with the recent historical time period as well. So pretty stable and strong growth for pharma. So that's a nice top line picture. Underneath that, of course, there are myriad drivers. Oncology, ever a big growth driver for the industry. There's a big focus on big disease states these days, which is coming through in the numbers as well. Alzheimer's, obesity, diabetes, for example. Big growth drivers, next generation therapeutics, rare diseases also. So a lot for the industry actually to be optimistic about, I think, despite the uncertainties that Mel was talking about. But surely new things to navigate for sure for pharma developers.
Just before we move on, and the number I had in my head from previous reports, I think was 7%. So is there anything meaningful to read from the consensus growth dropping from 7% to 6%, or is that just a reflection of kind of general, variability?
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard to unpick because there are so many drivers, but there could be a few. It could be the IRA feeding through a little into sell-side models. It could be maybe last year COVID was more of an uncertainty. Did we think, were the projections for COVID products greater? I'm not sure, but it could just be general market dynamics as well.
So you're sticking with optimism as well.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, Mel.
Okay, but yeah, optimism, but nonetheless, of course, still there are challenges, day-to-day challenges, as Mel described, for drug developers to navigate. And another one, or another chart, should I say, from the report, and on that theme here, we're showing the sales at risk. So one of those commercial uncertainties, I guess, the industry has to face is patent cliffs, right? So we have an upcoming new patent cliff, if you like. A number of the biggest products that, if you look at the industry today, in terms of sales, a number of those biggest products will be losing patent protection in coming years. So Humira this year, we've got the likes of Keytruda, Opdivo, Eliquis, and others, Eylea, I think, would lose market protection by 2028. So pretty big hitters, right, that the developers leading those assets will have to navigate, right? So if you look on the chart here, our data projects that around 6%, just over 6% of that industry top line sales figure is at risk in 2028 due to loss of patent protection. So lots for the developers of those assets, and I guess the broader industry to unpick there. Impacts on portfolio strategy, replacing that lost revenue, maybe if anyone would like to develop a biosimilar, clearly then developing a strategy around those assets. So it kind of varies by developer. It's either a challenge or an opportunity, I guess.
Absolutely, no, absolutely. I mean, a couple of things come to my mind. I mean, first, yeah, obviously, as you say, Paul, these lost sales have direct consequences for M&A activity, which we'll come on to a bit later. And also the impact of IRA dovetails with the exclusivity losses as well, because the drugs with generic competition are not subjected, don't fall into the sort of eligibility bucket for the price curbs. So you can imagine a sort of tricky decision in pharma board, management meetings. Do we ease off our fight against generic competition, which historically many in the industry have been very successful at? I think Humira's had an extra 7 or 8 years on its main body of patents, or do we, take our chances and hope we don't get caught by the Medicare price negotiation list? So that's an interesting new dynamic that'll come up on the navigating exclusivity losses and the IRA. And then just a couple of notes, 2 sentences, if I may, on Humira. I think are there 8 low-cost competitors have already been announced they're coming in. This is such a big drug. It could be the big one whose loss of exclusivity really catalyzes the US biosimilars market, which has sort of been really hard, hasn't it, to crack for various reasons. And this huge one may be the one that really turns it up. And I think some analysts are saying, $100 billion by 2029 for the US biosimilars market. So as you say, Paul, that's a big one. We're even seeing one of the big payers, CVS Health, going in and setting up its own biosimilar subsidiary. So it's a whole other discussion to be had there.
Fascinating. Just one anecdote that I'd throw in. So the last time we were at that 6% of sales at risk in any one given year, if you look at this chart, was back in the middle part of the last decade. And that's when actually sales were completely flat, or indeed actually declined year on year, which is unfoundable in today's industry where everything just goes up. But to draw it into your first slide, industry revenues are still growing in spite of this 6%, 5% patent cliff. So I guess not all patent cliffs are the same. Perhaps a patent cliff that is more biologics driven is not going to say less of a concern, because portfolios need to adapt. But interesting times and different factors at play for this patent cliff rewinding compared to a decade ago.
Yeah, no, great point. Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to the next of these snapshots from the reports, and always interesting to see the rankings. People are always interested to see those. And this first one here is the ranking in terms of top companies in 2028, according to Evaluate Pharma's consensus. You can see Roche just about pips the others to top spot here. It's about $65 billion in sales in 2028, but really not much to choose between the biggest players there. Pfizer, you can see a big decline. Of course, that is the very steep rise and fall of the COVID vaccines really driving that decline. But one thing I would make a point on here, which is I think an interesting one, is the emergence, not say emergence, maybe a climbing trajectory for Novo and Lilly, really on the back of this real cusp of revolution, I guess, in obesity and to some extent diabetes as well. The big products driving those markets are driving Lilly and Novo as well into the top 10. And that's at the expense of some established players. BMS and GSK drop out of the top 10 as a result of Novo and Lilly taking those spots. So that will be an interesting one to watch. And actually, these numbers were pulled for the report, but as a sign of how dynamic this list will be, if you look there now at this ranking, then Novo's even higher up the rankings, probably about number 3, I think. Just as a symbol, I guess, of how dynamic this will be and how there's so much more to understand, I guess, for that obesity market.
Perhaps analysts have been updating their consensus in light of the long-term cardiovascular outcomes data. And I know there's been a lot of interesting coverage about Novo being the most valuable company in Europe. So,
yeah, Novo's market cap is like catching up with the GDP of Denmark, something crazy like that. I mean, it's serious influence on Denmark's, avoiding recession or something like that. It's extraordinary. I mean, and Lilly's the 10th most valuable listed company in the world. It's overtaken, J&J, Walmart, easily. And Lilly's, don't forget, Lilly's obesity drug isn't even approved for obesity yet, and the analysts I think are putting 25 billion max on it. It'd be the biggest thing ever apart from the COVID stuff, and it's not even approved, and already Lilly's up there. And Lilly has, as your data shows elsewhere, I don't know if we have time to get to R&D pipelines, but Lilly has 2 or 3 proper promising phase 2 assets for obesity, which may be even more effective or more convenient, and it just bought Versanis for another mechanism of action drug that comes in at phase 2 as well. So this, as you say, this is just starting this obesity revolution, and these companies are going to be shooting up the ranks a bit more. Difficult to see when or where it might end, actually, as you say, Dan. The cardiovascular data, there's even a hint of efficacy perhaps in dementia for semaglutide. I mean, it literally, it's one to watch, should we say.
That goes back to the theory about Alzheimer's disease being a type 3 diabetes. And interestingly, Lilly as well is positioning itself in not just the hottest area in drug development, diabetes, obesity, but also Alzheimer's.
Yes. So everyone wants Lilly in their portfolio right now. Yeah.
So just, you mentioned companies that are no longer projected to be in the top 10. Is that a result not necessarily of their own doing, but more just the stratospheric rise, get my words right, the stratospheric rise of Novo and Lilly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, all these players have got their own challenges to deal with, right, and their own strategies for growth. But I think it's this stratospheric rise for Novo and Lilly that's driven them. Okay, and then next up we have similar ranking, but this time the top products in 2028. So a few highlights here. I mean, Keytruda, by far and away the biggest selling product in 2028, according to our consensus. You can see they're around about $30 billion product. So up there with the biggest, I guess, in history, really. Of course, Keytruda is a PD-1. If you look at the PD-1/L1 class, then that's around about a $70 billion market in 2028. Double what it is today, just to give a sort of indication of how extensive the growth anticipated there is. But I'll also highlight again, it's Ozempic and Mounjaro, back on this diabetes obesity discussion point, in at number 3 and 4, straight in there, straight into number 3 and 4 on the 2028 forecasts, and lots of room for growth there, I'm sure. There's a lot of data to be released, as you said, Mel. So this could be the beginning for those products. And I will just make the point about semaglutide, which you mentioned. Obviously, semaglutide being the ingredient behind Ozempic, but if we include Wegovy and Rybelsus, the other brands under which semaglutide's marketed, then that's an even bigger product if you take that as a whole franchise in 2028 than Keytruda. I think around $33 billion in sales.
So that is just Ozempic on there.
Yes,
right.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And I suspect if you were to look beyond 2028, the amount of time it's going to take to develop that obesity market, the amount of time it's going to take to build the manufacturing capacity for not just obesity, diabetes, but these other cardiovascular, even neurological indications. It could be a different top 10 or a different constitution.
Supply shortages don't bode well. I mean, they can't supply it, when it's not even widely reimbursed and still celebrity grabbing it. When it gets, if it gets approved more widely, that will be an issue. Just a couple of points on Skyrizi, actually. That's AbbVie's IL-23 blocking antibody. There's a battle weight, that's playing out quite aggressively now. They've recently submitted. I mean, this is one of their big ones, along with Rinvoq, that's sort of supposedly going to fill Humira's shoes. They just announced they've submitted for ulcerative colitis to FDA, Skyrizi that is, and they put out some recent positive head-to-head data actually versus J&J's Stelara, the competitor drug, which is incidentally on the list of the Medicare top 10 that are going to face price negotiations actually. And that head-to-head was in Crohn's disease. And it was designed to show non-inferiority. So clearly they weren't aiming too high, but it did actually, happily for them, if Stelara's price does get capped, it also showed superiority on one of the primary endpoints, endoscopic remission, which I won't delve into deeply, but did show superiority on that, and a couple of the secondary endpoints. So there's another battle in autoimmune playing out in a big way, one to watch as well.
Good. We'd like to see some upside to these forecasts.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, I think this is the last data slide we'll show. As Dan mentioned, there are many more in the report, so please go and take a look. But this chart here is showing the view by therapy area. Of course, that's always an interesting view as well. The x-axis here is sales growth to 2028. The y is the overall size of each therapy area market. So I guess the first thing to highlight, most therapy areas forecast for positive growth to 2028. There are only a few, as you can see here, vaccines, anti-infectives, musculoskeletal, forecast to shrink by our data to 2028. And clearly vaccines, anti-infectives, this is really, again, that come down from COVID. In musculoskeletal, I think there are a number of patent expiries that are driving that. But over at the other end of the chart, we have, oncology, always the standout. You can see it up there, flying high, if you like. So by far and away the biggest market by some margin, and pretty unique for its consistent growth status and scale. So you can see there, oncology will be around about a $340 billion market, I think that is, by 2028. So obviously huge. Second biggest CNS, we've got Alzheimer's and MS, for example, driving that. And then, innovation across the board, really, across multiple areas here. I'll also quickly mention immunology, really, on the bottom right. This is the area with the highest growth rate, but really that's an area with huge swings. So you mentioned Humira, huge decline for Humira forecast following loss of exclusivity, but then huge gains for the likes of Dupixent, which I think is the biggest forecasted immunology product. So, yeah.
And just the immunomodulators, I keep having to get you to clarify, that doesn't include checkpoint inhibitors and things. It's the immune disease focused ones. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, your statistic of checkpoint inhibitors being a 70 billion class in itself, remarkable. So I guess if you added that into the immunomodulators, you'd be doubling its position on the axis there.
Yeah, and I think some of the to your point, I think about the big drugs for big diseases becoming more prominent. We talked about endocrine and metabolic, cardiometabolic diseases. That's also reflected in some of the M&A we've seen this year as well, the big deals. Merck Prometheus in autoimmune, $10 billion deal, and Biogen's neurology deal to buy Reata. So yeah, we're seeing that come through. It's not all oncology, although, as you say, Dan, it just remains the king of the castle.
I mean, if we were to animate this graph, which is potentially something to look at in the future, these bubbles would be constantly fizzing, and oncology, I suppose, would have been rising inexorably. Is there a limit? Is there a ceiling to its rise? Or do you think other therapeutic areas might have some of the success in the clinic, which might yield some of the revenues? I mean, we've spoken already about Alzheimer's disease, about cardiovascular, or is just the scale of oncology just a different beast altogether?
I mean, it could happen, right? I mean, this obesity revolution gives an insight into how it could happen, right? Such are the expectations assigned to those products, for example. But clearly, oncology is just such a huge space, right? Such a complex space that I think it will take a while to catch up.
Yeah, I mean, there's another whole discussion there, isn't there? I think oncology, some might argue, is already coming off the boil a little bit. If you think about the last time there was a sort of Keytruda or Herceptin-sized drug commercially, it's been a while. And obviously, I don't want to downplay the huge value of the niche precision medicines that have been approved in the last decades that help enormous number of people. But we haven't got that sort of pan-cancer blockbuster, if you like, and a lot of the deals we've seen over the last few years in the many billions of dollars, Loxo, Lilly, etc., they're not delivering medicines yet that have the size of a Keytruda, of a Herceptin. So there is an argument to say, have we picked the low-hanging fruit, if you like, in oncology, and is it coming off the boil a little bit? But clearly this data, it ain't being toppled off the top by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that there are shifting dynamics in that market.
Clearly a lot of value in those smaller precision oncology drugs, but you perhaps just might need a larger portfolio in order to target the patient numbers.
Totally, exactly.
Okay. Well, I've really enjoyed that conversation and run through of the report. As I mentioned, there is there are many more slides to support this. So please do take a look at the full report if you can find time. But now I'm just like to transition into a more general conversation and like to touch back on that age of uncertainty, because I feel like we weren't able to delve any deeper and really kind of pick apart why you think it's that age of uncertainty. And I wanted to start first with the IRA because it is so topical. It's what everyone is talking about. We've obviously had the list, which removes some uncertainty, but then is that list even the final 10? Because might there be biosimilars and generics? And then the other thought is the amount of companies that are joining in this litigation effort. I mean, are we going to see the IRA in its kind of current form come to pass in 26? What's your thoughts there, Mel?
Crystal ball gazing. So those I speak to, shall we say, are very confident that IRA is not going to go away. So you're right. I think there are now at least half a dozen lawsuits. Interestingly, the lawsuits are being sort of added and withdrawn as a function of which company's drugs made it onto the top 10 list. I think Astellas withdrew because Xtandi, the cancer drug, got taken off, and Novartis filed a legal suit because its heart drug Entresto was included in this. So there's an additional uncertainty, as you hinted at, as to which 10 drugs or which 15 in future years will be on that list and how the sums are calculated. So no, the IRA as a whole, the consensus is not going to go away, but there is a strong possibility that it may get delayed a little bit, its implementation, because so the negotiations in theory start soon, if not already, and then the first price curbs are implemented from 2026. So there's a little while yet, and even I think a delay could be seen as a victory as far as the pharma industry is concerned, just kicking it down the road. But I think that's with us to stay.
So with the IRA, if we take the assumption that it is here to stay, clearly the IRA is shaping another thing that you touched on, so your area of uncertainty in FTC and deal making. So there's a sign or signals that of the deals that are getting completed, there is obviously an attraction for assets and companies that are less impacted by the Inflation Reduction Act. We saw the, I don't know if you can claim a winner or anything along these lines, but Amgen Horizon getting the go ahead with some concessions, so the FTC was able to claim a victory, but clearly the merger can still go ahead. Any read-throughs for this? And you mentioned the word defanged.
Yeah, well, let's say that there are voices that say, there are many that say that actually that wasn't a victory for FTC. I think the timing was a Friday afternoon or something. The announcement timing suggests that FTC sort of tail between the legs sort of scenario. They didn't let it go to court at all. It's presumably because they felt they had a pretty weak, their chances were pretty weak. So the industry saying, look, FTC didn't have a leg to stand on, and these new arguments that it's making about potential future harms with regard to pricing behavior, they haven't got that's just not going to cut it in court. And that may be true, but I was at a lawyer event last week, and regardless of who notches up the scores in the actual courts, if it gets that far, FTC and the European antitrust body, they do have, they're able to demand more documentation relating to deals, and some of it not all deal related. So any, conversations being had or documents being produced within a company that's seeking to acquire another group, just not draft documents not directly related to the deal. A lot of things, tens of thousands of documents that can be asked for, and people can be called in for review, just to slow down potentially this process and just make it more expensive and make it more difficult. So I would say it hasn't. The settlement with Amgen Horizon hasn't necessarily defanged FTC in terms of its ability to really slow things down a little bit, but it may mean that when it comes to the cut and dry legal thing, they may not, they might lose.
I guess in any case, the deals will still be done. Right?
Absolutely, they are going to still be done. It just means more lawyers and more documents and more faff, more faffing about, and so which is not a great thing, and it is uncertain. If a deal now takes 6-8 months, the company you're trying to buy might run out of money. There's so many things. This is a dynamic industry where, as you say, bubbles are fizzing, and it's very. Things change. So, we haven't really touched on the biotech market at the moment, but there are companies that, have a couple of months of cash and that's it. So, those are complicated dynamics. So, but as you say, Paul, the deals will have to continue. We've seen all the forces, all the tailwinds, if you like, pushing companies towards deal making. But there are these other forces.
Well, I guess it'll be fascinating to see how the deal-making landscape plays out in the coming months then, right? I mean, if we go back to the data, I think H1 this year was pretty strong, right, on recent years, with around 80 billion of deals announced. That's way up, I think, on any year since 2019 or something like that.
It is.
And as you say, the IPO window pretty much closed, venture financing, obviously a challenge. So there are assets to be bought, right? There are assets to be bought, although so I agree with everything you said, and I think that M&A tally will increase, but the M&A has been very focused, hasn't it, on late stage approved assets for obvious reasons. Nobody likes risk anymore, and everyone wants to fill the pipeline today. But as they get picked off, of course, deal making shifts upstream, becomes a little riskier, and that there are lots of great things about, but they're not all at the stage that many of the buyers would want them to be at. And I think this is where we're seeing some of the pricing and the competitiveness around the assets that are perceived to be the most valuable, also with regard to IRA and all that.
So where are we seeing these deals being concluded? I mean, 80 billion is a heck of a number. And presumably there is more to come with all of the incentives and needs to refill pipelines. What are the most kind of biotechs or pharmas that are in vogue can slot into a larger company's portfolios?
Well, I guess Pfizer Seagen was the really big deal, right? But I guess oncology will continue to be a focus, right? Combination approaches in immuno-oncology, presumably still a hot topic. So how to find those assets, right, to test in combo. I don't know, Mel, if you have any.
Exactly. I mean, as I mentioned, immunology, inflammation, we're seeing some big deals there. Neurology, the Biogen deal, we saw, Merck Prometheus deal, as you say, the Pfizer Seagen as well. So I think there's almost a wider expanse in terms of therapy areas being covered. And, although we've talked about big drugs for big diseases, and that's exciting because there had been, relatively perhaps neglected over the last decade or two as the precision oncology was so in vogue. Niche assets are still really popular, and we've seen plenty of deals for companies with rare diseases. Horizon is one of them, right? Amgen bought Horizon, and their assets are for rare diseases, and they're attractive because they've always been attractive. We've done. Evaluate's done a lot of work on orphan drugs and the advantages and importance of that category. But the IRA angle on this is that the Inflation Reduction Act won't touch single indication orphan drugs. So those are exempted, if you like. And that, of course, does make certain assets more attractive, although it gets a bit more complicated when you have multi-indication rare disease drugs. But that's another niggle, should we say, another uncertainty within the IRA, under the IRA umbrella. So I think those rare diseases, immunocardio will continue to be important, oncology as well, and neurology, as you mentioned, coming back after decades in the doldrums. Absolutely.
Just a reminder to our audience, please do continue to submit your questions. I have seen some come in, and we're going to transition the conversation into some of those quickly. But yeah, definitely get in touch. Cardiometabolic. I mean, clearly it's been a topic. Is this an area that companies are going to be acquiring into? Is it too late to build an R&D pipeline from internal, or are we expecting this might be the next wave of M&A?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it? I think, so take Novo Nordisk. So Novo Nordisk for years, I mean, I remember covering dealmaking. I've covered dealmaking for a long time. We were slightly sniffy about Novo Nordisk. They never bought anything. They never bought anything big or interesting. And they just stuck to their knitting, which is diabetes, insulins and all the corollaries. And obviously now the GLP-1, which is the mechanism of action of semaglutide, agonizes the GLP-1 receptor. So they've been rewarded for that, if you like, by now being the size of Denmark. So I think, so that it hasn't just happened overnight. I think Lilly tirzepatide was developed in-house, according to definitions of when and where things are in-licensed. I think it's quite difficult now. It's a bit like, well, look, the share price spikes are already there. The assets have already gone up in cost and in attraction. Therefore, it's you can buy your way into anything, but it'll be more costly. I mean, we've seen Lilly buy Versanis, but again, these are still pretty good. I mean, great deal for Versanis's investors, but probably for Lilly, no big deal. The upfront wasn't actually, was the upfront? I don't think the upfront was separated out for that deal. But you can imagine it's a nice deal for the VCs and nothing for Lilly, because they've got the position they have already, and they just want to add to their pipeline as much as they can of different mechanisms. So I'd say it's tricky to sort of buy in quickly. You have to buy expertise as well, of course. And there aren't many big biotechs focused on obesity around, because it hasn't been a very popular area. They don't reimburse obesity drugs in the US. The American Medical Association didn't recognize it as a disease till about 10 years ago. I mean, it really is catching up, if you like, on many fronts. So yeah, tricky to buy in.
So there's a link there to one of the questions that's come in, and I want to bring in big biotechs, and clearly the sentiment around biotechs and investment into these companies has been down for 18 months, 24 months. What does this mean how is this being surfaced in the data that we're shown, or is it too soon to actually see biotech struggles in consensus forecasts for the industry as a whole? Is it going to be beyond 2028? Just how do you see, I suppose, this downturn through the lens of evaluates data? I'll put that to you, Paul.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of tricky, right? Because the forecast is still very much on the up, right? So I don't think it's easy to see in the data that reflected, right? Apart from, of course, looking at the deal totals, etc., etc. So yeah, I'm not sure.
So just to be clear, though, you're asking how the downturn in the biotech, so public and private biotech markets, is impacting pharma growth, because they're a key feeder into pharma pipelines, and therefore if they're struggling and running out of money, where are the future pipeline fillers going to come from? Is that essentially?
Yeah, I suppose that's the crux of the question, because biotech, I mean, I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but certainly the narrative is that biotech discovers a lot of the assets, whether it's through platform companies or asset-driven companies, and then pharma either licenses these or acquires these. So if you are, I suppose, not choking, because clearly there is still a lot of investment, a lot of financing going into these biotechs, but if the pipeline is constrained just even a little bit, presumably that then limits pharma's opportunity to grow revenues.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't read too much. These are cycles, as you know, they go up and down, and nothing is forever, even though it's hard to believe it sometimes when you're in the depths of the sort of post-COVID bubble burst, etc. And I know many companies are struggling and will continue. There's still quite a bit to play out. I think you've actually Evaluate has data on the proportion on the average share of pharma pipelines that are externally sourced. Did we look at that earlier in the year? Was it 40% or more? It depends on the company. I know it was very company specific, but it is considerable. So I think there's an argument there. I don't think you can look at a single downturn, a couple of years, and worry about the future pipeline. I think there's tremendous amounts of super innovative, fascinating science out there. There's a lot of VC money, as you say. It's just that it's not that easy to access by the current cohort of existing companies with their legacy of VC rounds at certain valuations, etc., etc. There's a lot of great science. VCs have built up enormous funds. PE, private equities come in with mega billion funds into this industry, recognizing its long-term potential and the trajectory of the data you've shown us, Dan, which is sorry, Paul, which is, you know, up basically, even if it might be a bit less up, you know. So I don't think we need to worry on that front.
The other observation I would have actually in response to the question is, well, it's an interesting thing. In the same year that biotech financing was down, so presumably the amount of money that could be invested into drug discovery and clinical trials has also struggled. Big Pharma itself, the R&D spending was flat year on year, 2022 versus 2021. And this is in a year where inflation has been running at, what, 8%, 10%? Those two things happening in tandem is a sign of, not a warning sign, but it's an interesting observation. And I wonder how sustainable that would be. Clearly, one of those two things would need to change in order for that 6% forecast growth to 28 to continue to grow beyond 2028. Whether it's a case of actually, are we seeing pharma, will we see pharma and R&D spend need to rise and actually increase their share of innovation? Because the tide has certainly been going towards biotechs for quite a few years. But as you say, investments go in cycles. The optimist in us is here somewhere, you know, think it must get better soon.
It must. I mean, and your data, they evaluate, data's fantastic, you know, but it, you know, as you said already, Paul, it does change. So that may be a little shift downwards in terms of R&D spend growth. It's still growing, just growing less quickly. And if we look at it next year, perhaps it might tick up. And, you know, there's the AI factor, perhaps they're going to be more efficient, they think, and therefore they don't have to spend as much because they've got these great tools. I'm a little skeptical, and that may not be the explanation. But I think one has to wait for a longer term, a few more years of data to worry. And, you know, pharma have had a pretty golden, you know, decade. And, you know, the profit margins in the industry are still healthy. I don't think this is, you know, an extinction risk by any stretch of the imagination. And yes, there are new challenges. And, you know, these are big societal questions about what we're willing to pay for healthcare. I mean, I don't want to get too big on us, but, you know, it does feed into some bigger questions about paying. And I think we haven't talked about the payer landscape, but I think there's another whole basket of uncertainty there.
Well, let's say what. Hopefully the audience can join us along there, but let's go there. So uncertainty around the payer landscape. So you're suggesting it's not just a contained event with Medicare negotiating for 10 drugs this year and 15 or in subsequent years. Are we looking at a much bigger scale of uncertainty?
We absolutely are, Dan. Absolutely, yes. You know, the short answer. Yeah. So the IRA is very, you know, it got a lot of attention. It focuses on the drug and, you know, pharmaceutical firms putting up their prices too quickly, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't touch on these other players in the US industry, the pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs as they're called. These are middlemen that negotiate the prices of drugs with the pharmaceutical manufacturer and then sell those drugs on to insurers to provide through providers to their insured, to their, you know, people, their individual subscribers. And they've been, you know, making profits from rebates and, you know, taking shares of prices and etc. And, you know, engaging in some not so nice practices. And there's a whole swathe of new legislation coming through specifically attacking those PBM middlemen, those middlemen in the US industry. And pharma might say, oh yeah, at least it's not us. They're the real culprits for these high prices that American consumers have to pay for drugs. And yeah, great, you know, have a go at them, lawmakers. But actually, of course, if these laws, which are going to progress, and I think they are bipartisan and they do have a lot of momentum behind them, if any one of them gets passed and does clamp down on the practices of these middlemen, these middlemen purchasers, that's going to have an impact on pharma, right? Because the PBMs are going to say, well, hang on, we're seeing our profits taken out of our pockets by these new laws, so we're going to squeeze you on your new drug prices and squeeze the insurers at the other side. And insurers already are, you know, big and powerful, and their voices are getting louder about what they will and won't pay for and how easy they'll make it for patients to access drugs. So absolutely, that's a whole other bit that, you know, watch this space. Is the industry is going to come home to roost, if not already has or is, that we need to watch out for, you know. And now, particularly given these weight loss drugs that are coming on, then they're going to be, you know, given the statistic around obesity, they are going to be hugely expensive for payers, and payers are going to have to find ways to say, no, you can't have it because we can't afford it, and you've got to stay on it for years, and we simply can't afford it. Sorry to be, I'm always so gloomy.
Well, someone has to, thank you for assuming the role. And actually, I do want to go with one more positive question. And I'm apologies, I'm going to put this one to Paul, but the industry outlook beyond 2028, I know clearly it's clouded with a bit more uncertainty, and like any forecast, the further out you extrapolate, the more kind of plus or minus upside downsides there are. But any views on what the data might show us beyond 2028?
Well, I guess that is crystal ball now and no data to actually look at, but you know, I'd like to see the trajectory continue, right? I mean, notwithstanding the access challenges, right, for obesity, that's a new growth avenue, right? What's the next one going to be? I mean, Alzheimer's certainly hasn't played out, of course, fully. So, I mean, the industry's ability to, via innovation, meet society's needs, right, through treatment advances, is pretty phenomenal. So, yeah, I'd be optimistic that the industry can grow. But, you know, this affordability challenge, if you like, has been a debate forever, right? And it will never go away. It will just evolve, I guess.
And just a note on beyond 2028, hopefully we're sat here in the same room next year discussing Evaluate World Preview 2024. And I think in the next edition, we will be extrapolating those analyst consensus forecasts until 2030. So a couple more years to look forward to, but of course, with the caveat that the further out you go, and I know this from experience, your forecasts are still useful, but there's more and more uncertainty, especially as towards the tail end of a forecast period, much of the growth drivers are driven not by drugs that are already on the market that you might have a bit of confidence in their life cycle management, but from assets that are still in phase 2, phase 3. We all know that there is a likelihood of approval that's associated with each and every one of those assets. Not all of those revenues that are projected will come to pass. But yeah, something to look forward to perhaps for the next edition is it feels weird saying it, but 2030 it's not that time yet, but getting towards it. But speaking of time, I'm going to wrap up the webinar here. So thank you for everyone that submitted a question so far. Please do continue to get in touch. If you'd like to learn any more about the report, any feedback on the conversation, please get in touch and we'll follow up with you. But all that's left is to thank you for joining us for the last hour or so. Mel, thank you again for writing the report and joining us for the conversation.
Pleasure.
And Paul for the data and insights. Great, thank you very much. Bye now.
Bye-bye.